law in the 1930s, leading to renewed global war. The United Nations, and that catastrophe is humanity's second great effort to place international law above international anarchy. In the words of the Charter, the
Riverside helps with the entire process of making a podcast, from recording to edit and even generating clips automatically from your podcast.
Given that we are in the nuclear age, failure cannot be repeated. Humanity would perish. There would be no third chance. To fulfill its responsibilities under the Charter, the Security Council should immediately affirm the following actions. The United States shall immediately cease and desist from all explicit and implicit threats or use of force against Venezuela. The United States shall terminate its naval quarantine and all related coercive military measures undertaken in the absence of authorization by the UN Security Council. The United States shall immediately withdraw its military forces from within and along the perimeter of Venezuela, including intelligence, naval, air, and other forward deployed assets positioned for coercive purposes. Venezuela shall adhere to the Declaration of Human Rights. The Secretary General, I recommend, should immediately appoint a special envoy mandated to engage relevant Venezuelan and international stakeholders and to report the Security Council within 14 days with recommendations consistent with the Charter, and the Security Council should remain urgently seized of this matter. All member states should refrain from unilateral threats, coercive measures, or armed actions undertaken outside the authority of the UN Security Council. In closing, Mr. President and distinguished members of the Council, peace and the survival of humanity depend on whether the United Nations Charter remains a living instrument of international law or is allowed to wither into irrelevance. That is the choice before this Council today. Thank you very much.
I thank Mr. Sachs for his briefings. I now give the floor to Ms. Mercedes de Freitas. My apology. I now give the floor to Ms. Mercedes de Freitas.
Good morning. I speak in Spanish. Please give the translation. Buenos días, embajadores,
Good morning,
representantes de estados y
ambassadors,
gobiernos. Gracias
representatives
por
of
esta oportunidad.
states and governments. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to speak.
Sí, sí, no me escuchan.
Can you hear me?
Aló, aló, ¿me
Can you
escuchan?
hear me?
¿Me
can
escuchan?
hear you,
Disculpe,
yeah.
ya estoy aquí. Excuse me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Good morning. I speak in Spanish. Buenos días, señores embajadores,
Good morning,
representantes de
ambassadors,
estados.
representatives
Gracias por esta
of
oportunidad
heads
de
of state and
presentar los
government.
resultados
Thank
de
you
investigaciones que
to
desde Transparencia
enable me to
Venezuela
tell you something about Transparency
hemos estado
Venezuela,
desarrollando para
the work that we have been
el,
doing
para la okay. He organizado
we have organized
la información que voy a presentar
I've
en 5 puntos.
I've organized some information I'm
Me
going to
oigo
put forward
en-
to you in
me
5
oigo-
points.
No puedo bajar el volumen. Bueno, he
Continue.
organizado la información que voy a presentarles en 5 puntos.
I've arranged the
Los
information I'm
pocos
going
minutos que
to
tengo.
give to you in
Punto
around
número
5
uno.
points. Let me make
La
the
red de
most of my
gran
time.
corrupción
First of
transnacional
all,
de origen
one,
venezolano
the
tiene presencia con empresas,
corruption
propiedades
in
y actividades en
Venezuela
73 países del mundo.
is seen in some
Hemos
3 countries of the
organizado
world. We have
cientos de
organized,
casos que
we've
hemos
seen
documentado
hundreds
a
of
lo largo
cases
de
that
los
we have
años,
documented over the
más de
years,
500 y 600
more,
casos en
more than
diferentes
500,
países.
600 cases in
Solo
various
en los
countries.
sistemas de justicia
Continue, we can hear you. Go ahead, continue. Can you hear us? We can hear you. Can you hear us?
Solo en los sistemas de justicia de 30 países
We looked at the justice
se
systems of
procesaron
30 countries,
172 casos de
and
gran corrupción,
172 cases
donde
were
el 60%
dealt
de
with for
ellos
corruption,
suma más de
and
72 mil
um,
millones
more
de
than
dólares.
$72 trillion were involved.
Esos 72 millones de dólares que
$1
están
million
comprometidos
were
son
involved.
dinero público venezolano.
This was public
Nicolás
Venezuelan money.
Maduro y su
Nicolas
familia
Maduro and his
son el
family.
Y el puente estuvo.
The interpreter cannot hear
Y
the
el de
speaker.
Petróleo de Venezuela ha sido el instrumento central, involucrada directa e indirectamente en el 90%
It
de
was a
los casos
system
de
that was
corrupción
involved in
que hemos
90%
identificado.
of the corruption
Punto número
cases.
2.
Point number
Las
2,
organizaciones criminales nacionales
the
y
national
internacionales
criminal
tienen una
organizations,
relación simbiótica con la administración de Nicolás Maduro.
the interpreter cannot hear the speech
Utilizando
to
las estructuras
provide
del
sufficient
Estado
interpretation. I
para
apologize.
facilitar, soportar y dirigir las operaciones ilícitas. Las economías ilícitas de oro, droga, extorsión y trata de
Miss
personas
Freitas,
alcanzaron en
Miss Freitas,
2024
Miss
8.000
Freitas,
millones de dólares.
can you
según
hear
nuestra
us?
estimación.
Miss Freitas,
De la producción de oro, ¿sí?
can you hear us? The interpreters cannot hear you. Can you slow down and raise your voice a little bit?
Hay un delay.
There's a delay, says the speaker. The problem the interpreter is having is with the quality of the sound, which is insufficient for interpretation.
Sí,
It's not the speed.
dígame. Sí, la oigo con delay. Sí, sí,
I'm
la oigo.
hearing you, but with a delay, says the
Sí, la
speaker.
escucho.
I can hear you, though.
Okay. Please proceed now.
Ok, perfecto.
Very well.
El punto número 2. Las
Point
organizaciones
2.
criminales nacionales e internacionales
National and international criminal organizations
tienen una relación simbiótica con la
have a
administración de Nicolás
symbiotic
Maduro,
relationship with the
compartiendo
regime of Nicolas
capacidades,
Maduro,
utilizando
sharing
las estructuras
capacity,
del Estado
using the
para
state
facilitar,
structures to
soportar,
facilitate
impulsar, proteger y dirigir las
their work
operaciones
and to
ilícitas.
protect
Las
illicit
economías ilícitas
operations
de oro,
in
drogas,
gold, for example,
extorsión y
drugs,
trata de
extortion,
personas,
and human trafficking.
alcanzaron, según nuestras estimaciones,
And according to our estimates,
8.200.000 millones de dólares.
this
El de
accounts
la
for
producción
about
de oro, por
$8
ejemplo, solo se
billion.
reporta el
Gold, for
20%
example,
al
only
Tesoro
20%
Nacional.
is
El
reported
resto
to the
va
National
a
Treasury.
cuentas
The rest
privadas
goes to
de
private
miembros
accounts
aliados del
where
alto gobierno.
there are members and allies with the
Ese
government.
proceso minero, además,
This
ha destruido áreas completas de
mining
nuestro estado
industry
Bolívar,
has exploited
del Parque
so
Nacional
many
Canaima
people
y de
using
nuestro
national
Amazonas.
parks and also
Para
the
lavar el
Amazon
dinero
area.
de la
And then
corrupción
to
y el
launder the
crimen
money from
organizado, la
corruption,
red comparte
the
operaciones
network
de dinero
has
muy
money laundering
sofisticadas.
structures that are
Y
very
desde el
sophisticated.
2021
And since 2020,
utiliza la reducción de los ingresos del Estado
has led
y
to a
por ende del
decrease in the
gasto
income of the
del
state and
empleo de
therefore
calidad,
public
de los servicios
expenditure,
básicos.
and therefore economy
Tampoco
is
hay
in
dinero para
crisis.
pagar la
There's
deuda,
no
que hoy
money
suma
either to service the debt.
167.000 millones de dólares que tiene a Venezuela en cesación de pagos selectivos en un default técnico desde el
although
2017,
Venezuela has been in
donde el primer
technical
acreedor
default
es
since
Chile, al que
2017.
aún le debemos más de 15.000 millones de dólares.
We owe more than $15 million.
Los
For
venezolanos hemos tenido que aprender a
Venezuelans
vivir
have
con
had to
pocas
learn
horas
to
de
live
luz
with
en
just
gran
a
parte del
few
país, de
hours
Caracas,
of
incluso en otras ciudades
electricity
del país.
per day in very many
Hay
parts of
que
the country.
hemos aprendido a protegernos
And we've
de la
learned to
extorsión
protect
diaria
ourselves
y
from
generalizada
daily
desde los grupos
extortion
armados
from the
colombianos,
armed
desde los grupos
from the
criminales
armed Colombian
organizados,
groups or the
pero también
organized crime
lamentablemente
groups, but
desde los funcionarios del Estado.
also
Millones
elements
de
of the
familias
state.
tienen una sola comida al día,
So many
con
families
bajo
only
nivel
have one
calórico.
meal per
Los
day
datos de
below the
desnutrición
calories
y
that they need,
nutrición empeoran
affecting
cada
their
día.
nutrition, which is
Los
getting worse
programas
day by
humanitarios
day.
no son suficientes.
Humanitarian programs are not
Se
sufficient.
eliminó el sistema de contrapesos y la independencia entre los poderes públicos. Ese es mi quinto punto.
And then
El
5, there's
grupo en el
no
poder
checks
hoy
and
en día en
balances
Venezuela
between
tiene capturado toda
government
la estructura
departments.
institucional,
The
comenzando
government
por el
has
sistema de
captured
justicia
all
y con la
institutions,
industria
beginning
petrolera,
with the
principal
justice
generadora de
institutions
ingresos
and
y de
also
los
the
oligopolios
oil
de los
company
sectores económicos
responsible
clave.
for the majority of
Para
income
mantener
for
el
the country. In
control y
order
la
to maintain
impunidad de los
control
negocios ilícitos,
and the impunity of these illicit
aplican un
operations,
sistema represivo cada
a
vez más
repressive
atroz.
system that's getting
Hoy,
worse and worse is being applied.
además, hay más de
And
1.000 presos
today there are
políticos,
more
cifra
than
que cambia
1,000
tras una
political
aterradora
prisoners.
puerta giratoria. Para finales de año,
At
86
the end
de
of
esos
the
presos políticos se
year,
desconocía su paradero y 26 personas ya han muerto bajo custodia del Estado
26
durante torturas
people
o por falta de
died
atención
during
médica. La
torture
misión de
or because
determinación de
a
los
lack of
hechos de
medical
Venezuela de
care.
Naciones Unidas ha documentado cientos de
United
torturas
Nations has
y esto
documented many of
no se ha
these
detenido aún.
cases.
Para cambiar esta realidad necesitamos un Estado íntegro y transparente, que
We
rinda
need a
cuentas,
transparent
que
state that is
garantice el Estado de
accountable,
Derecho y
that
los
will
derechos
guarantee the
humanos,
rule of
que
law and
proteja
human
los
rights,
recursos
that will
públicos para el beneficio
protect
de todos, sin
public
privilegios,
goods for
con
everyone
un
without
sistema de justicia
privilege,
autónomo e
a
independiente.
system that's autonomous and
Necesitamos inversiones de
independent.
capitales
We need
constructivos
investment
que nos
in
permitan
building
pagar la deuda,
capacity
pero también
that
crecer, sostener con dignidad a todos los
will
venezolanos. Que se
enable
respete
us to
la
have a
voluntad
dignified
del
life.
pueblo venezolano de
We
vivir
must respect the will
en
of the
democracia.
Venezuelan people
Por
to live
último,
in
una
peace and
petición
democracy. And
que
finally, a
resume
request
la
to
libertad
you.
para todos los presos
Freedom
políticos
for all
venezolanos.
political prisoners
Muchísimas
in the
gracias.
country. Thank you very much.
I thank to Ms. Freitas for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Colombia.
Señor presidente,
Mr. President,
Colombia agradece a
Colombia would like
Somalia
to thank
en su
Somalia
calidad de
in your
presidencia del
quality
Consejo de
as
Seguridad
President
por
of the
haber
Security
acogido
Council
con celeridad
for
nuestra
having
petición
quickly
para
responded to
convocar
our
esta
request
reunión
to
de
convene
emergencia,
this emergency meeting,
así como a China
as well
y
as thanking
Rusia
China and
por el
Russia
apoyo a
for
esta
their
convocatoria.
support
Le
for holding of
deseamos a
this
usted,
meeting.
señor
And we wish you,
presidente,
Mr. President,
una exitosa gestión durante este mes de enero,
a
en un
successful
momento
month
particularmente
managing the
delicado
work of the
para la
Council
paz y la
at a
seguridad
particularly
internacional.
delicate time for international peace and
Asimismo,
security.
agradezco a la
I'd also like
subsecretaria
to
general
thank
para Asuntos Políticos
Undersecretary General
y de
for Political
Consolidación
Affairs
de
and
Paz de las
Peace Building
Naciones
of the
Unidas
United Nations
y a los oradores
and the
invitados por
invited
sus
briefers. We
presentaciones.
thank them all for their
Esta es la primera intervención
briefings.
de Colombia
This
en
is
el
the first
Consejo
time
de
Colombia is
Seguridad
taking the
como el
floor in the
miembro
Security
no
Council as a
permanente para el
non-permanent
periodo
member for the period
2026-2027.
2026-2027.
Colombia asume esta
Colombia
responsabilidad
is
con
taking on this
profundo sentido de
responsibility
deber y
with a
lo
deep
hace.
sense of duty.
Desde el primer día,
And
en
we are going to
defensa
do this from the first
inequívoca
day,
del derecho internacional y de los
defending
principios y
international law and the
propósitos
purposes and
consagrados
principles
en la Carta de
enshrined
las
in the
Naciones
United
Unidas,
Nations Charter.
la paz, la
International
seguridad
peace and
internacional, la
security,
solución
the
pacífica de las
peaceful settlement
controversias,
of disputes,
la prohibición
the
del uso de la
prohibition of
fuerza,
the use of
la
force,
igualdad soberana,
sovereign
el
equality,
respeto a la integridad
respect for
territorial
the
y la
territorial
independencia
integrity and
política de
political
todos los estados.
independence of all states.
Colombia condena de
Colombia
manera categórica
condemns
los sucesos
categorically
ocurridos en la
the
madrugada
events
del
that
3 de enero en
occurred in the early
Venezuela,
morning of the 3rd of
en donde se
January
han
in Venezuela,
registrado múltiples
where we saw
explosiones
multiple
actividad aérea
explosions
sobre
and
Caracas
air
y
activity
otras
over
zonas del
Caracas
país
and other
en el
areas of the
contexto de
country
un
as
ataque
part
militar
of a
llevada
military
por los
attack
Estados Unidos,
carried out by
el
the
cual ha
United
incluido
States, which
bombardeos sobre
included
instalaciones
bombings of
militares,
civilian and
generando
military
pánico entre la
infrastructure,
población.
creating panic amongst the
Todo esto
population.
representa
All of this
evidentes violaciones a
represents
la
clear
soberanía,
violations of the
la
sovereignty,
independencia
political
política y la
independence,
integridad
and the
territorial
territorial
venezolana.
integrity of
No
Venezuela.
existe justificación
There
alguna
is no
en ninguna
justification
circunstancia
whatsoever under any
para el uso
circumstances for
unilateral de
the
la fuerza ni
unilateral
para
use of
cometer un
force
acto de
to
agresión.
commit an act of aggression.
Dichas acciones
Such
constituyen una
actions
grave
constitute a
violación del
serious
derecho internacional
violation
y
of
de la Carta de la
international
ONU,
law and the United Nations
incluida la
Charter,
prohibición
including the
del uso o la amenaza del uso
prohibition
de la
on the
fuerza,
use or the threat of the
el
use of
principio de
force,
respeto a
the
la
principle
soberanía
of the
y
respect
autoridad
for
plena de
sovereignty
los
and
estados
the full
sobre su
authority of
territorio,
states over
incluyendo
their
sobre sus
territory,
recursos
including their
naturales,
natural
la integridad
resources,
territorial
the
de los
territorial
estados y
integrity of
los
states,
principios de
and
defensa
the
colectiva,
principles of collective
especialmente
defense,
cuando
particularly
ponen en riesgo
when
directo a la
they
población
directly
y a bienes
endanger
de
the
carácter
population
civil.
and civilian
Defender estos
assets.
principios no es una
Defending
opción,
these principles is
sino
not an
una
option.
obligación común
Indeed, it's a
para
common
preservar la paz
obligation
y
that
la
we have
seguridad
in order to preserve
internacional.
international peace and
Es
security.
necesario recordar
We
que las
need to
disposiciones de la
remember
Carta
that the
se
provisions of the
admite
Charter
el uso de la fuerza
allow for the
solo
use
en
of force
circunstancias
only
excepcionales,
under exceptional
como la legítima
circumstances,
defensa ante un ataque armado
in
o
legitimate
cuando
defense in the
existe
face of an
una
armed attack, or
autorización
when there is
expresa
an
de este
express
Consejo
authorization by
conforme a
this
su
Council
capítulo
in
séptimo
accordance with
y aún
Chapter 7.
en esos casos
And even
no
in
es para
those
asumir el
cases,
control político
this does
del
not
otro
amount to
Estado.
assuming political control of
En
another
este
state.
sentido,
In this
rechazamos
regard,
cualquier acción
we
militar
reject any
unilateral,
unilateral
cualquier
military
acto que
action,
pueda
any
agravar la
act that could
situación
worsen
o
the
poner en
situation
riesgo
or
la población
endanger the
civil.
civilian
Y hacemos un
population.
llamado a
And
la
we would
desescalada
call
y a
for
no
a
acudir al uso de la fuerza,
de-escalation
poniendo en
and
riesgo a las
non-resort to
personas
the use of force,
quienes en
which
esta delicada
endangers people
situación deben
finding themselves
ser
in
la
this delicate
prioridad
situation.
absoluta.
They must be the
Ya
absolute
hemos
priority.
aprendido con nuestra
We
experiencia
have learned
que la
from our
población
experience
civil
that
es
the
siempre
civilian
quien
population
paga
is
el precio
always
más alto
the one
de
that pays the
la
highest
confrontación
price
armada.
in armed
Señor
conflict.
presidente,
Mr. President,
América Latina y el
Latin
Caribe
America
se ha
and the
proclamado
Caribbean
como una
have
zona de paz.
proclaimed themselves
Y
to
esa
be
voluntad
a
y
zone of
compromiso
peace, and
colectivo
this
de nuestra
collective
región debe
commitment
ser
and
respetado.
will of our
Acciones
region
unilaterales
must be
contrarias al
respected.
derecho
Unilateral
internacional
action that
ponen
is
en
contrary to
riesgo la
international
estabilidad
law
regional,
endangers regional
incrementan la
stability,
inseguridad
increases
y
insecurity,
agravan ya
and
las ya
worsens
complejas
the already
condiciones que
complex
experimenta la
conditions
población
being
civil
faced by the
con
civilian
efectos
population,
devastadores
with
que
devastating effects that
trascenderán las fronteras
will
soberanas de Venezuela,
transcend
con
the
un
sovereign
impacto
borders of Venezuela
directo
to
sobre
have
los
a
países
direct
de la
impact
región
on
como
countries
Colombia.
of the region, such as
De manera
Colombia.
preventiva, Colombia ha dispuesto medidas
In
para
order to act
proteger a la
preventively,
población civil
Colombia
y
has
preservar la estabilidad en la
engaged in measures
frontera,
to protect the civilian
atendiendo las
population and
eventuales
preserve
necesidades de
the
la
stability
población,
of the border,
especialmente de la
addressing
población
the
migrante,
possible needs of the
en
population,
coordinación
particularly
con
the
las
migrant
autoridades
population,
locales.
in coordination with local
Colombia ha
authorities.
sido y seguirá
Colombia
siendo
has been and will
receptor
continue to
solidario de la
be
población venezolana,
uh,
que ante la
show solidarity in
incertidumbre que
receiving the
representa la
Venezuelan people
crisis
who,
ocasionada por estos ataques,
given the
puede
uncertainty
generar
created
un
by these
flujo
attacks,
masivo de
this may lead
migración
to a
que
massive outflow of
demandaría
migration,
un
which will require
significativo esfuerzo en
significant
recursos y
efforts in terms
capacidades
of resources
para
and
brindar el
capacities
debido
to
apoyo y
provide the
asistencia en las
necessary
zonas
support and
acogida.
assistance to those
Señor
areas
presidente, estas
affected
acciones recuerdan los peores
by
momentos
taking
de
in the
injerencias en la
migrants.
política
Mr. President,
latinoamericana y del Caribe
these
y
actions that we
constituyen
have
una
seen
clara amenaza a la preservación
remind
de
us
la
of the
región como
worst
una zona de paz.
interference in
Imagine being able to build an app with your name on it just by thinking about it. Meet 44.
calls to mind the commitment that we peaceful settlement in full accordance with international law and with its instruments to which we have subscribed at the hemispheric and regional levels, such as the Charter of the Organization of American States. It's also important to understand the dimension of this situation for international peace and security beyond our region, particularly when a permanent member of the Security Council takes the decision to use force and assume control unilaterally of another sovereign state, with the aim, amongst other things, of taking its natural and strategic resources. This is very worrisome for the international community, the international order that was established after the Second World War, and flagrantly violates international law and is in clear contradiction with the United Nations Charter and the very goal for which this council was created. If a country, and particularly that is a permanent member of this council, disregards international law that we designed in San Francisco, what then is the role of this council, and where are the founding the interests of the strongest prevail over multilateralism and over agreements that we have forged with dialogue and diplomacy in this very chamber? Democracy cannot be promoted or defended through violence, coercion, and it cannot be suited either by economic interests. Democracy can only be built and sustained through respect for the will of peoples, the reaffirmation of the rule of law, through political dialogue and peaceful and inclusive processes. Venezuela deserves to live in peace, in democracy, prosperity, and dignity, with a government that is defined in sovereignty by no one else than the Venezuelan people and their institutions. This is why Colombia has reiterated its call to open up paths for democracy in Venezuela through specific popular decisions being taken. The importance of preserving peace, respect for international law, and the protection of life and human rights must prevail over anything else. Colombia reaffirms its conviction that working tirelessly under these principles in our new role as a non-permanent member of the Security Council is what we plan to do, and we make ourselves available, good offices available for a diplomatic way out of the current crisis in this brotherly country. We will meet our responsibility, primary responsibility, to maintain international peace and security. And given the seriousness of the events, we will continue to pay attention to this issue. And we'd also like to thank the Secretary General of the United Nations for providing his good offices to defend the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter, to activate channels for mediation available to him and facilitate dialogue with the parties concerned, looking in the search for alternatives that will make it possible to find a way out of the situation led by Venezuelans themselves and provide assistance to Venezuelans that need this. In conclusion, we'd urge the parties to exercise maximum caution and restraint, to de-escalate tensions, and to follow dialogue and diplomatic channels, and develop mechanisms to avoid continued flagrant violations of international law. This will require the help of the United Nations and of regional organizations. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Colombia for her statement, and now give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Mr. President, first and foremost, we wish to congratulate you on your accession to the presidency of the Security Council. And second, we wish to welcome the newly elected members of the Security Council. The beginning of this new year shocked all of those throughout the world who cherished the hope that respect for international law and non-intervention in domestic affairs of other states, as well as a reliance upon diplomacy and seeking of compromise, became key principles in the work of the new U.S. administration. The assault against the leader of Venezuela, compounded by the deaths of dozens of Venezuelan and Cuban, of a turn back to the era of lawlessness and U.S. domination by force, chaos, and lawlessness, which continues to afflict dozens of states in various regions of the world. There is no and can be no justification for the crime of the United States in Caracas. We firmly condemn the U.S. act of armed aggression against Venezuela in breach of all international legal norms. In connection with the confirmed reports about the presence of the abducted president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, and his spouse in the United States, today, as we are aware, they're in New York, we call upon, corrects the speaker, the U.S. leadership to immediately release the legitimately elected president of an independent state and his spouse. Any problems existing or conflict between the United States and Venezuela need to be resolved through dialogue. And this is precisely what is enshrined in the UN Charter, the purposes and the principles which a number of states in recent years have begun to apply selectively, depending upon the political landscape. Today, we are reaping the consequences of their recklessness and selectivity in matters related to respect for the norms of international law, which were linked to the. Here is your rules-based world order in all of its glory, which is horrifying even the staunchest Atlanticists. Mr. President, we extend our firm solidarity with the people of Venezuela in the face of the external aggression. We firmly support and completely support the policy of the Bolivarian government, which is geared towards protection of their national interests and the sovereignty of the country. Washington's aggressive acts have already been condemned by many states and multilateral associations, including the Non-Aligned Movement, the African Union, as well as a group of friends in defense of the Charter of the United Nations. We hope that the international banditry will immediately be met with objective and comprehensive assessment at the international legal level with United Nations, universal mechanisms, and other multilateral formats being brought to bear. This process must not be impacted by the recognition or non-recognition by any given states or groups of states of the legitimacy of Nicolas Maduro. For this reason, unintelligible murmurings and attempts to avoid principled assessments by those who in other circumstances froth at the mouth and demand that others respect the UN Charter today seem particularly hypocritical and unseemly. We hope you will recognize this, and we hope that you will abandon double standards and that you will not attempt to justify such an egregious act of aggression due to a fear of angering the American global gendarme, which is attempting to once again rear its head. We are particularly appalled by the unparalleled cynicism with which Washington did not even attempt to conceal the true aims of its criminal operation, namely the establishment of unbridled control over Venezuela, Latin America. In this way, Washington is generating fresh momentum for neocolonialism and for imperialism, which were repeatedly, decisively condemned and repudiated by the peoples of this region and by the global South as a whole. Distinguished colleagues, under these circumstances, it is exceedingly important for the entire international community to unite and to definitively reject the methods and tools of U.S. military foreign policy, which have been demonstrated in the case of Venezuela. This is the only way it is possible to compel Washington to revisit and to abandon their dangerous misconceptions. As we stated during previous meetings on Venezuela, the bell now tolls across the region, ringing for every country of the Western Hemisphere. The bell is ringing for all UN member states and for the future of the organization itself. Failing to hear this call today is tantamount to projecting cowardice and the lack of principle, essentially blessing ongoing encroachments of international law and rejecting civilized international conduct as a whole. We cannot allow the United States to proclaim itself as some kind of a supreme judge which alone bears the right to invade any country, to label culprits, to hand down and to enforce punishments, irrespective of notions of international law, sovereignty, and non-intervention. Is this the world we sought to attain as we marked the 80th anniversary of the adoption of the Charter of the United Nations, when we all signed on to the relevant Security Council presidential statement? Is this the aim of United Nations reform, which we all advocate? Or has the United Nations and Security Council thereof, do they no longer exist? And is there need now to seek from Washington a patent to rule, so to speak? And is the self-determination of every person's and their right to determine their future worthless? These are the questions that we all must address today. And if this response is sincere, if it is principled, then perhaps the U.S. leadership too, which openly is asserting intention to run another country for the benefit of the United States, they will perhaps glance at their own constitution, their constitution of the United States, which begins with the words, "We the people of the United States," and will begin, in fact, to recognize the sovereignty of other states rather than deposing inconvenient regimes. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Russian Federation and now give the floor to the representative of China.
President,
中方支持
China
安理会
supports the Security
就
Council
美国对委内瑞
holding
拉
an emergency
发动
meeting
军事打
regarding
击
the United
召开
States
紧急会
military
议。
strikes on Venezuela.
感谢迪卡洛副秘
And
书长
thanks USG
宣读
Di
古特雷
Carlo
斯
for
秘书长
reading
的通
out
报。
the briefing of the Secretary
我
General
认真听
Guterres.
取了
I
通
have
报人的
listened
发言，
carefully to the statements of the
欢迎委内
briefers
瑞拉常驻
and
代
we
表
welcome to this
和其他
meeting
国
the
家代
permanent
表
representative
出席
of
会议，
Venezuela and
就
represents
大规模
blatantly
军事打
launched
击，
large-scale military
强
strikes
行控制
against
委内瑞
Venezuela,
拉总统马杜
forcibly
罗及
seized
其夫人，
Venezuelan
并
President
移
Nicolas
送出境，
Maduro and his wife,
宣
and
称
took them
管理
out
委
of
内
the
瑞拉，
country. It
甚
claimed
至不排
that
除
it will
实
run
施第二
Venezuela
轮
and even
规模
didn't
更军事
launching
行
a
动。
second round of military operations
中
on
方
an
对美
even
方的
larger
单边
scale.
非法
China
霸
is
凌行
deeply
径
shocked
深表震
by
惊，
and strongly
予以
condemns
强
the
烈谴责。
unilateral, illegal, and bullying acts of
一
the
段时间
U.S.
以来，
For some
国际社
time
会
now,
多次
the
对美
international
方针
community
对
has
委内瑞拉
repeatedly
的制
expressed
裁封
grave
锁
concern
和武力
over the
威胁
U.S.
表示
sanctions,
强烈担
blockade,
忧。
and threats of force against
安理会召
Venezuela.
开2次
The
紧急会
Council
议，
convened 2 emergency
古特雷
meetings,
斯秘书长、
during which
广大安理会
Secretary
成
General
员、
Guterres,
地区
many
国家
Council
和域外
members,
国家
and countries
一
in
致
the
呼吁
region and
遵
beyond
守联合国宪章
unanimously called
和
for
国际
abiding
法，
by the UN Charter
保持
and the
冷静
international
克制，
law, maintaining
和
calm
平
and
解决争端，
restraint,
推
resolving
动局
disputes
势降级，
peacefully,
维护
de-escalating
地区稳
tensions,
定。
and safeguarding regional
然而，
stability. However,
美国作为
as a
安理
permanent
会
member of
常任理事
Council,
国，
the
无视
U.S.
国际
has
社会严
disregarded
重
the
关切，
grave concerns of the
肆意践
international
踏委
community,
内瑞拉主权、
wantonly
安
trampled
全
upon
和合法
Venezuela's
权益，
sovereignty,
严重违
security,
反
and legitimate
主
rights
权
and
平等
interests,
原则，
and seriously violated the
严重违
principles
反
of
不干
sovereign
涉内政
equality,
原则，
non-interference in internal
严重违
affairs,
反和平解决
peaceful
国际
settlement
争
of
端原则，
international disputes,
严重违反
and
在国
the
际关系中
prohibition of
不
the
得
use
使用
of
武力原
force
则。
in international relations.
这些原则
These
是联合国
principles
宪章的根
constitute
本要
the
义，
fundamental tenets of the UN
构成了
Charter
维护
and
国际和平
form
与安
the
全的基
cornerstone
石。
of maintaining international peace and
美方将自
security.
身强
The
权
U.S.
凌驾
has
于
placed its
多边
own
主义之
power
上，
above multilateralism
将军事
and
行动
military
凌驾于
action
外
above
交努力之上，
diplomatic efforts,
严重威胁
posing a
拉美
grave
和加勒
threat
比地
to
区
peace and
乃至
security
国际
in
和平
Latin
与安
America
全。
and the Caribbean, and
中方对此
indeed
坚决反对，
internationally. China
国际社
firmly
会也
opposes
普遍
this,
表
and the
示严
international
重关切，
community has also expressed
予以强
widespread
烈谴
grave
责。
concern and strong condemnation.
我们敦促美方
We urge the
正视
U.S.
国际社
to
会
heed
压倒
the
性呼声，
overwhelming voice of the
遵
international
守国际法
community,
及联合国
abide
宪
by
章宗旨
international law
和原
and the
则，
purposes and principles of
停
UN
止侵犯
Charter,
别国主权、
cease
安全，
infringing upon the
停止
sovereignty
颠
and
覆
security
委
of
内瑞
other
拉政
countries,
权，
stop toppling the
回归
government
通
of
过对话谈
Venezuela,
判、
and
政治解
return
决
to the
问题
path
的轨
of
道。
political solutions through
我们呼吁
dialogue
美
and
方确保马
negotiations.
杜罗总统
We
和
call
夫
on
人
the
的
U.S.
人身
to
安全，
ensure the personal
将他们
safety of
立
President
即释放。
Maduro and his wife, and to release
我
them
们支
at
持安理
once.
会履
We
行维护
support
国
the
际和平
Council
与
in
安全的
fulfilling its
首要
primary
责任，
responsibility to
支持联合国秘
maintain
书长
international
地
peace
区
and
国家和组
security,
织
and we support
一
all
切有助
efforts
于
by the UN
推动对
Secretary
话
General,
和
regional
局势
countries,
降级的
and
努力。
organizations that contribute to promoting dialogue
主
and
席，历
de-escalating
史
the
教训
situation.
因见不远，
President, the
军
lessons
事
of
手段
history are
不
a
是解
stark
决问题的
warning.
出路，
Military means are not
滥
the
用武力
solution
只
to
会导
problems,
致
and
更
the
大的危机。
indiscriminate use of force will only lead to
美国
greater
曾绕开
crises.
安理会，
The
对伊
U.S.
拉克发动
bypassed
军
the
事行动，
Council to launch military
悍
operations
然袭
against
击
Iraq,
伊朗核设施，
blatantly attacked Iran's nuclear
对拉美和
facilities,
加勒比
and
地区
imposed
多国实
economic
施经济
sanctions,
制裁、
military strikes,
军事打击，
and
甚
even
至武
armed
装占领，
occupations on multiple countries in
造
Latin
成持续
America
冲
and
突
the
动荡
Caribbean.
和巨大
These
民生苦
actions
难。
have caused
上述
persistent
行为
conflict,
是否带来
instability,
了
and
和平与
immense
稳定？
suffering for the
是否
ordinary
带来了
people?
发
Did
展与
these
繁荣？
actions bring peace
国
and
际社会
stability? Did
看
they
得
bring
清清楚
development
楚。
and prosperity? The international community sees
委
this
内瑞拉
clearly.
是独立主权国家，
Venezuela is an
完
independent
全有
sovereign
权
state
捍卫自
with
身主
every
权
right
和
to
民族尊
defend
严。
its sovereignty and national
拉美和
dignity.
加勒比地区国家
Countries in
是
Latin
维护世
America
界
and
和
the
平稳定、
Caribbean are
促
important
进全球
forces
发展
in
繁荣的
maintaining world
重要
peace
力量，
and stability and
完全
promoting
有
global
权自主
development
选
and
择发展道
prosperity,
路
and they have
和
every
合作伙
right
伴。
to independently
没有哪个
choose
国家
their
可以充当
development
国际
paths
警
and
察，
partners. No
没有
country
哪
can
个国
act
家
as
可
the
以自
world's
诩为
police,
国
nor
际
can
法官。
any state presume to
中
be
方
the
坚定支持
international
委内瑞
judge.
拉政府
China
和人
firmly
民
supports the
维护
government
主
and
权、
people of
安全、
Venezuela
正当权益，
safeguarding their sovereignty,
坚定支
security,
持地区
and
国家
legitimate
维
rights
护
and
拉美
interests.
和加勒
We
比地
firmly
区
support the
和平
regional
区地位，
countries in upholding the status of
要求
Latin
美方
America
改
and the
弦更张，
Caribbean as a
停止
zone
霸
of
凌胁迫行
peace.
径，
We demand
同地
that
区
the
国
United
家
States
在
change
相
its
互尊
course,
重、
cease its
平等相
bullying
待、
and coercive
互不干涉内政的
practices
基础
and
上，
develop relations
发
in
展关系，
cooperation with regional
开展合
countries
作。
on the basis of mutual respect, equality, and
中方愿同地
non-interference
区
in
国家
international
和国际
affairs.
社会一道，
China stands ready to
加
work
强
with the
团结
regional
合作，
countries and the international
坚持
community to
公平
strengthen
正义，
solidarity and
共同维
cooperation,
护拉美和
uphold
加勒比地
fairness
区
and
的
justice,
和
and
平
jointly
与稳定。
safeguard peace and stability in Latin America and the Caribbean.
谢谢主席。
I thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for the statement and now give the floor to the representative of Liberia.
I would say it's like having another producer in the room that knows exactly what your song needs. This is co-producer, the fastest.
The Democratic Republic of Congo, Somalia, and my own country, Liberia. We thank the presidency for promptly convening this important meeting. We congratulate Somalia on assuming the presidency of the Security Council this month and warmly welcome all new members. The A3 appreciates USG DiCarlo's comprehensive briefing and listened carefully to the remarks offered by civil society representatives. We also welcome the representative of Venezuela and the representatives of the region to this meeting. Mr. President, the A3 aligns itself with the recent communique of the African Union on the situation in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela and continues to monitor developments there with deep concerns. In particular, we note reports regarding the detention of President Nicolas Maduro and his wife and incidents involving Venezuelan institutions. Such developments present serious challenges not only to Venezuela's internal stability, but also underscore the imperative to safeguard the broader peace and security of the region. The A3 remains steadfast in its commitment to the fundamental principles of international law, including the full respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states as enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations in the interest of regional stability and international peace. We believe these are essential foundations for international cooperation and peaceful coexistence. Our position underscores the importance of dialogue, the peaceful settlement of disputes, and respect for constitutional and institutional frameworks. Mr. President, the complex situation in Venezuela requires a comprehensive response that is both inclusive and nationally owned. We continue to hold that a sustainable and peaceful resolution can only be found through constructive dialogue among Venezuelans themselves, with the of the Venezuelan people, and with the constructive support of the international community. The A3 expresses its solidarity with the people of Venezuela and reiterates the African Union's commitment to peace, stability, and mutual respect among nations and regions. It's important for all and in the broader international community to exercise restraint and responsibility, upholding international law and avoiding any action that could escalate tension or threaten regional stability. The A3 stands ready to support all efforts within this council and in cooperation with regional partners to facilitate a peaceful, inclusive, and lasting resolution to the situation in Venezuela. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States.
Mr. President, thank you for chairing. And I particularly want to thank you, Mr. Freitas, for your briefing. And I'll point out that Mr. Freitas is in exile, having fled the regime. Thank you for your courage, and thank you for shedding a light on the true atrocities of the illegitimate Maduro regime. This past weekend, colleagues, the United States successfully carried out a surgical law enforcement operation facilitated by the U.S. military against two indicted fugitives of American justice, narco-terrorist Nicolas Maduro and Celia Flores. Colleagues, Nicolas Maduro is responsible for attacks on the people of the United States, for destabilizing the Western Hemisphere, and illegitimately repressing the people of Venezuela. As Secretary Rubio has said, there is no war against Venezuela or its people. We are not occupying a country. This was a law enforcement operation in furtherance of lawful indictments that have existed for decades. United States going to stand trial in accordance with the rule of law for the crimes he's committed against our people for 15 years. A similar action was taken in 1989 against Manuel Noriega. He was arrested, indicted, convicted in a court of law, served in prison in the United States and in Panama, and the Panamanian people, the American people, are safer for it. And undeniably, the region was more stable. This law enforcement action was directed consistent with the President of the United States' responsibility as Commander-in-Chief to protect Americans at home and abroad against a fugitive who is directly responsible for narcoterrorism that has killed hundreds of thousands of Americans and created destabilizing violence throughout our hemisphere. Nicolas Maduro and his co-defendant, Celia Flores, have been transferred here to the United States to stand trial for their crimes. Maduro was indicted by a grand jury in the Southern District of New York and faces very serious criminal charges to conduct narcoterrorism, to maintain their illegitimate grip on power. In fact, just 2 years ago in 2024, a UN panel of experts report found that the election in that year was absolutely and completely a farce and fell well short basic transparency and integrity measures essential to upholding credibility. the direction, clandestine or otherwise, of the Maduro regime in Venezuela. Maduro and his cronies have partnered with some of the most violent and prolific drug traffickers and narco terrorists in the world for decades, facilitating the flood of illegal drugs coming in the United States, estimated to be several hundred tons annually. He has become rich, incredibly wealthy, off the misery of untold numbers of Americans, Venezuelans, and others, aiding and abetting international terrorist organizations like Hezbollah, coordinating with corrupt Iranian officials and other malign actors to influence not only the region, but to malignly influence the United States. In fact, in its own 2025 World Drug Report, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime identified Venezuela as a key trafficking route in the Western Hemisphere, the illegal drugs, predominantly cocaine, entering the United States and increasingly Europe. As Secretary Rubio stated just yesterday, this is the Western Hemisphere. This is where we live. And we're not going to allow the Western Hemisphere to be used as a base of operation for our nation's adversaries and competitors and rivals of the United States. You can't turn Venezuela into the operating hub for Iran, for Hezbollah, for gangs, for Cuban intelligence agents, and other malign actors that control that country. You cannot continue to have the largest energy reserves in the world under the control of adversaries of the United States, under the control of illegitimate leaders, and not benefiting the people of Venezuela, and stolen by a handful of oligarchs inside of Venezuela. But it doesn't stop there. Numerous UN and international human rights organizations have issued reports documenting serious human rights abuses by the Maduro regime, including reports of extrajudicial killings, political prisoners, torture, and arbitrary and unlawful detentions. In fact, over 8 million Venezuelans have fled the country, destabilizing their neighbors in the region and creating the world's largest refugee crisis. Members of this council, colleagues, the United States wants a better future for Venezuela. We believe a better future for the people of Venezuela and for the people of the region and the world is stabilizing the region and making the neighborhood that we live in a much better and safer place. And this is why millions of Venezuelans that have this brutal regime are celebrating around the world as this body pontificate, including those celebrating are including in my home state of Florida, where hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans have fled this regime's brutality. I want to reiterate, President gave diplomacy a chance. He offered Maduro multiple off-ramps. He tried to de-escalate. Maduro refused to take them, made it clear that the narco-terrorism must stop, and yet it continued. The United States will not waver in our actions to protect Americans from the scourge of narco-terrorism and seeks peace, liberty, and justice for the great people of Venezuela. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States, to the representative of Panama.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Extendemos